Our Beatles now, as we're nearing the end of 1962, I know we started the show in 63, which is strange. Now we're back to our timeline. At the end of 62, they are well-oiled. They're a top-level act with big Vox amps ready to take on the world. Actually, the bigger crowds in the future will necessitate bigger amps from Vox. But that's another topic. That's for later. It's time for Where We Going, Fellas?
When the Beatles were depressed, thinking the group was going nowhere, and this is a shitty deal, and we're in a shitty dressing. I say, where are we going, fellas? And they say, to the top, Johnny. And I say, where's that, fellas? And they say, to the toppermost of the toppermost. I say, right. And we all cheer up. Johnny, to the toppermost of the toppermost. Where are we going, fellas? Where are we going, fellas?
In the first half of November 1962, the Beatles were in Hamburg, much to their chagrin. Paul said
Hamburg was dead, as far as we were concerned.
They had much bigger things to think about. They really wished they were back in the UK promoting Love Me Do, which they were afraid would lose momentum if they weren't there.
If you're a Beatle in 1962 and you think your music may be about to conquer Britain, it's a big fucking deal. It's going to dominate your brain. And so suddenly fulfilling an overseas contract that was already made ages ago would feel like an irritating distraction. It's easy to get into their headspace on this one.
Yeah, very much. But a couple of interesting things did happen in Hamburg. Listeners probably remember that the Beatles played 2 shows with Little Richard in October in Liverpool. Including their first ever show at the Empire Theatre. The boys were extremely excited about being able to hang out with one of their idols at the time, so it was a pretty big deal to be heading back to the Star Club in Hamburg to open for Little Richard for 12 days. John actually said,
we used to stand backstage and watch Little Richard play, or he used to sit and talk. I still love him. He's one of the greatest.
The matchup seems perfect in a way. Maybe like mentoring or something.
It probably felt that way. And how about this? Here's what Ringo said about someone else who Little Richard brought with him to play in Hamburg.
Who could it be?
Ooh, who could it be?
So these are the words of Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr?
Of Richard Starkey, yes. Yeah.
Quote.
Yes.
Little Richard played at the Star Club in Hamburg with Billy Preston. Billy was 16 and he was fabulous. I watched Little Richard play twice a night for 6 days. It was so great.
And yeah, he actually said 6 days. Ringo's memory is not exactly great. Peace and love.
Well, maybe Ringo watched only one of the 2 weeks.
Yeah, right. Maybe.
Hey, Billy is a great player, just and a great performer.
Yeah. Oh, watch Get Back. This is probably the typical thing, right? You watch Get Back and you watch him and he's like, he's incredible. I can't even imagine being able to play like that. Well, but incidentally, apparently George asked Billy Preston to sit in with the Beatles, but Preston decided against it because he thought Little Richard would be mad. And I would guess Brian would be as well. Remember, he didn't want anyone to appear on stage with the Beatles anymore. Like piano player Roy Young had just about every day the last time they were at the Star Club.
Right.
He even underlined that clause in the contract with the Star Club. Nobody else.
Yeah, the fourness of the Fabs was like part of the branding he was trying to cultivate, one would suppose.
Yeah. But so here's something else that I find really hilarious. Little Richard had some things to say about the 2 weeks. There's a possibility that he was exaggerating, but Little Richard said,
Well, they'd come to my dressing room and eat there every night. They hadn't any money, so I paid for their food. I used to buy steaks for John. Pa would come in, sit down, and just look at me. He wouldn't move his eyes. And he'd say, Oh, Richard, you're my idol. You just let me touch you. He wanted to learn my little holler. So we sat at the piano going, ooh, till he got it.
So, Larry, does that sound like Paul to you?
I would say, ooh. I don't know. Paul was doing the ooh a long time before he met Richard.
He was.
Yeah, right?
Yeah,
He had practiced that like in the late 50s, you know?
Oh, sure, yeah.
I don't know. It sounds to me like Paul through Richard's prism.
Yeah, very much.
I think that having him and Billy and the Sounds Incorporated as headliners must have been inspiring for the Beatles as show people. Showbiz, you know how it is. The crowds must have dug it all, but we don't find anyone describing the crowds this time around. Usually we get descriptions of the German crowds, either they're gangsters or sailors or whatever. But I guess it was capacity anyways.
Well, supposedly the Star Club held 2,000. So that's a lot. And then there's the other thing that happened that I think was pretty amazing about those 2 weeks. Brian wanted some new promotional photos, of course, and contracted Astrid Kirchherr to take them. He had, of course, seen the incredible photos that she had taken of the Beatles over the last couple of years. Larry, we've talked about how Astrid, as well as Jürgen Vollmer, had been students of Reinhard Wolf, whose studio was used for the photo session. Do you have any thoughts about how those shots went?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't researched Reinhard Wolf's style of studio photography or whether Astrid's and Jürgen's methods follow his setup exactly, but there seems to be, in her photography, always one light source, the sun or maybe one indoor light, giving the photos natural depth. I'm not a photographer. I wish some professional photographer could sit in for me here, but I do love those photos. I can't articulate really why, though.
Oh, I do know that the Beatles themselves liked the style so much that they would ask photographers in Liverpool, such as Les Chadwick, to try to imitate Astrid's shots.
So they were doing that. I thought Brian was asking them to do that. Somebody out there must know more about the Wolf, Kirchherr, Vollmer style. Vollmer, sorry.
Yeah.
Vollmer style of posing and lighting. Please go ahead and contact us on social media. See the links in the show notes.
It's a good idea.
This is Beatles 60.
This was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find one or two other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient. But our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles 60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. there's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles 60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who have been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological historiographic study.
Larry,
Eh?
what's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years. As nothing would make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle.
Beatles 60. We ain't jumping around.